A judge insulted Pam Bondi right in court, and minutes later, Florida's former Attorney General had him handcuffed. You won't believe what just happened. Before we dive into this wild story, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the latest jaw-dropping tales. The marble floors of the Miami-Dade County Courthouse echoed with Pam Bondi's confident footsteps as she strode toward courtroom 4B. Her tailored navy suit and the determined set of her jaw projected the image she'd cultivated throughout her career, unflappable, meticulous, and formidable. As Florida's former Attorney General, now working as a high-profile prosecutor, she had faced countless difficult judges, but Judge Howard Gates had a particular reputation that preceded him. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Howard Gates," the bailiff announced as the side door opened. Gates swept in, his black robes billowing behind him. At 62, he carried himself with the entitled air of someone who had wielded unchecked power for decades. His thin lips seemed permanently set in a dismissive smirk, his eyes cold as they surveyed his domain. When his gaze landed on Bondi, something flickered across his face. Contempt, perhaps, or irritation. "Be seated," he barked, not bothering to acknowledge the crowded courtroom. The case before them was high profile. A prominent real estate developer accused of massive fraud that had left hundreds of investors penniless. The evidence Bondi's team had assembled was substantial, methodical, and damning. But from the moment she stood to present her opening statement, it became clear that Judge Gates had no intention of giving her a fair hearing. "Your Honor, the state will demonstrate through irrefutable evidence that the defendant, Robert Keller, orchestrated a sophisticated—" "Miss Bondi," Gates interrupted, pronouncing her name with a slight sneer. "Spare us the dramatic preamble. This court doesn't need your televised performance style." A ripple of uneasy murmurs spread through the courtroom. Bondi paused, maintaining her composure. "Your Honor, I'm simply presenting the state's case, as is standard procedure." Gates leaned forward. "What's standard is following my courtroom protocols. Get to the specifics or yield the floor." Bondi nodded once and continued, adjusting her approach. But each time she attempted to outline the complex financial crime, Gates interrupted with dismissive comments. "Is there an actual crime here, or just financial misunderstandings that the prosecution is attempting to criminalize?" he asked, drawing appreciative chuckles from the defense table. When Bondi attempted to introduce financial records showing clear evidence of wire fraud, Gates sighed theatrically. "Miss Bondi, we don't have all year. Your tendency to over-document is well known, but in my courtroom we value efficiency." The defense attorney, Martin Reynolds, barely needed to object. Gates was doing his work for him. Reynolds, a silver-haired veteran of corporate defense, exchanged knowing glances with his client. This wasn't just judicial impatience, it was calculated obstruction. By mid-morning, the pattern was unmistakable. Every crucial piece of evidence was met with judicial skepticism, every witness testimony undercut before it could gather momentum. During a brief recess, Bondi gathered her team in a side conference room. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes blazed with determination. "He's not even trying to hide his bias," her assistant prosecutor whispered. Bondi nodded slightly, watching as Judge Gates chatted amicably with Reynolds in the hallway, their body language suggesting a familiarity that went beyond professional courtesy. "This isn't his first time," Bondi replied quietly, "but it might be his last." She opened her briefcase and removed a slim file marked "Confidential." Inside were documents that represented months of quiet investigation, a contingency she had hoped wouldn't be necessary. "Are we going there?" her assistant asked, eyes widening. "Not yet," Bondi replied, returning the file. "Let's see how far he's willing to go." As the bailiff called for court to resume, Bondi straightened her jacket and walked back into the courtroom, her mind already mapping out the chess moves ahead. Judge Gates might believe he held all the power, but he had severely underestimated who he was dealing with. The afternoon session began with the prosecution's star witness, a former financial officer from Keller's company who had documented years of fraudulent transactions. As the witness was sworn in, Judge Gates's demeanor shifted from merely dismissive to actively hostile toward the proceedings. "Mr. Harrington," Bondi began, addressing the witness, "could you explain to the court how Mr. Keller directed you to falsify investment returns?" Before Harrington could answer, Gates intervened. "The witness will limit his testimony to factual observations, not conclusions about the defendant's intentions. Your Honor, Bondi replied evenly, Mr. Harrington received direct instructions from the defendant. That's not a conclusion, it's first-hand testimony. Gates's face flushed slightly. Miss Bondi, do not presume to lecture me on evidentiary standards. I've been on this bench longer than you've been trying cases. The defense table didn't bother hiding their satisfaction. Robert Keller, the defendant, actually smiled, a flash of white teeth that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. His confidence was palpable, and to Bondi's experienced eye, revealing. Every time the witness attempted to detail the paper trail of diverted funds, Gates found reasons to limit the testimony. Speculative, hearsay, beyond the scope. His rulings came rapid fire, each one stripping away critical context from the evidence. During Bondi's attempt to introduce email communications showing Keller's knowledge of the fraud, Gates's interruptions grew more personal. Ms. Bondi, your theatrical approach might work for press conferences, but this is a court of law. Perhaps if you spent less time in front of cameras and more time studying procedure, we wouldn't need to keep correcting your approach. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Even seasoned court reporters looked up in surprise at the openly condescending tone. Bondi maintained her professional demeanor, though her team could see the slight tightening of her jaw. For the record, Your Honor, I'm following standard prosecutorial procedure, and I'd appreciate the court's impartiality in this matter. What you'd appreciate is irrelevant, counselor. What matters is how I run my courtroom, Gates snapped. Consider yourself fortunate I'm not holding you in contempt for implying bias. Throughout the afternoon, Gates continued to undermine the prosecution's case. When Bondi attempted to question the defendant's business partner about offshore accounts, Gates shut down entire lines of questioning as fishing expeditions. When financial records clearly showed millions in misappropriated funds, he deemed them administratively burdensome and limited how many could be entered into evidence. The gallery watched with increasing discomfort. Several jurors exchanged confused glances, clearly recognizing the imbalance in treatment between the prosecution and defense. One juror, a retired accountant, frowned deeply as crucial financial evidence was dismissed without proper consideration. During the final hour of the day's proceedings, Gates's behavior crossed another line. When Bondi objected to a misleading characterization by the defense, Gates sighed dramatically. Overruled, Miss Bondi. Perhaps in your previous political position you grew accustomed to making unfounded accusations without challenge. That doesn't work here. Reynolds, the defense attorney, barely concealed his smirk as he continued questioning his witness, now free to lead them through a sanitized version of events that omitted all criminal intent. At her table, Bondi wrote a quick note to her assistant prosecutor. 3 pattern cases, Marshall, Donovan, Westridge. Her colleague nodded, understanding immediately. These were other cases where Gates had shown similar bias, all involving wealthy defendants with connections to specific business interests. As court adjourned for the day, Gates made one final jab. Miss Bondi, I expect better preparation tomorrow. This court won't waste time on disorganized prosecution tactics. The defense team gathered their materials with barely contained triumph, while the gallery buzzed with whispers about the judge's unusual hostility. Bondi packed her briefcase deliberately, her movements measured and calm. To the casual observer, she appeared to be taking the judicial rebuke professionally. Only her closest team members recognized the look in her eyes. Not defeat, but strategic calculation. He's getting sloppy, she murmured to her assistant as they walked out. Arrogance makes people careless. Outside the courtroom, a reporter attempted to get a comment about the day's proceedings. The state remains confident in our case, Bondi replied diplomatically. Justice has many phases. This is just one of them. What neither Judge Gates nor the defense team realized was that Pam Bondi hadn't come to this courtroom unprepared for this scenario. In fact, she had been counting on it. Back at the prosecution's temporary offices, Bondi spread several files across the conference table. Her team gathered around, faces grim but determined. The clock showed just past 8 p.m., They'd been reviewing materials for hours since court adjourned. It's not just today, Bondi said, pointing to a spreadsheet detailing Judge Gates' ruling history. Look at the pattern over the past 3 years. The analysis was striking. In cases involving certain corporate defendants, particularly those represented by specific law firms, Gates's rulings deviated significantly from statistical norms. Evidentiary exclusions ran at nearly 80% against prosecution, compared to a typical 30% baseline for similar cases. The Marshall case was the first red flag, Bondi's investigator Rachel Torres explained. A textbook securities fraud with mountains of evidence, but Gates systematically dismantled the prosecution's case through procedural rulings. Bondi nodded, retrieving another file. Then the West Ridge real estate scandal last year. Same pattern, same result. What had begun as Bondi's cautious background research into judicial records had evolved into a comprehensive investigation when the patterns became too suspicious to ignore. As a former attorney general, she had resources and connections that extended beyond the typical prosecutor's reach. The financial trails were the hardest to trace, Torres continued, pulling up several bank records. Gates maintains a modest lifestyle on the surface, nothing flashy, nothing suspicious. But, Bondi prodded, his son's real estate company has received mysterious cash infusions coinciding with major cases. Torres indicated a timeline where property acquisitions by Gates's son aligned perfectly with significant case dismissals. 3 shell companies, all leading back to beneficiaries connected to defendants who appeared in his courtroom. The assistant prosecutor whistled softly. How has this stayed hidden so long? Because Gates is smart, Bondi replied, disguises his bias behind procedural rulings and evidentiary decisions, areas where judges have broad discretion, and he doesn't rule for the defense every time, just in cases where significant money is at stake. She pointed to a photo showing Gates at a charity event, standing near several people, including Robert Keller, the current defendant. This connection wasn't in any disclosure forms. The team spent another hour reviewing the sealed package they had prepared weeks earlier, a comprehensive ethics complaint backed by financial forensics, statistical analysis of rulings, and sworn statements from former clerks who had observed troubling behavior. The question is timing, Bondi's deputy said. If we file this now, Gates could claim it's retaliatory because the case isn't going our way. Bondi smiled slightly. That's why we submitted it to the Judicial Ethics Board last month, and to the FBI 3 months ago. Surprised faces turned toward her. I've been building this case for over a year, she explained. When I learned we'd drawn Gates for the Keller trial, I knew what would happen. His behavior today wasn't just predictable, it was necessary to complete the pattern of evidence. She pulled out her phone, checking a secure messaging app. The federal investigation is already well advanced. They were waiting for one more clear example of Gates's pattern, which he helpfully provided today. Another prosecutor asked, "So tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," Bondi confirmed. "We spring the trap, but we need to be methodical. Gates will lash out when cornered." As the meeting concluded, Bondi remained at the table, reviewing one final document, a sealed arrest warrant for Judge Howard Gates, pending final approval based on today's court transcript, which would provide the last piece of evidence needed. She thought back to Gates's condescending smile, his dismissive tone, the way he had publicly attempted to humiliate her. For a moment, she allowed herself to anticipate the satisfaction of tomorrow's reckoning. Then, professional as always, she returned to reviewing the evidence, ensuring every detail was perfect. In his 20 years on the bench, Judge Gates had developed a sense of invulnerability, believing his position placed him beyond accountability. Tomorrow would prove just how mistaken he was. Justice, it turned out, worked in both directions. When court reconvened the following morning, an air of anticipation hung over the room. The gallery was unusually full. Word had spread about Judge Gates' inappropriate behavior toward the former Attorney General. Several senior attorneys from other courtrooms had found reasons to observe the proceedings, and a few additional media representatives squeezed into the back row. Pam Bondi entered precisely 5 minutes before the scheduled start, accompanied by her usual team, plus one addition, a distinguished older man few recognized, who took a seat directly behind the prosecution table. Only those familiar with federal proceedings might have identified him as Richard Harmon, senior counsel for the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section. When Judge Gates swept in, his demeanor seemed even more imperious than the previous day. He cast a dismissive glance at the crowded gallery. "I see we've attracted an audience," he remarked dryly. Let me remind everyone that this is a courtroom, not a theatrical performance." His eyes lingered on Bondi with thinly veiled disdain. "Miss Bondi, are you prepared to proceed more efficiently today?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied simply, her voice steady. "The state is fully prepared." Gates nodded, satisfied with what he interpreted as submission. "Then call your next witness." "Before we continue with testimony, Your Honor, there's a procedural matter I need to address," Bondi said, rising from her seat. Gates frowned. "We've wasted enough time on procedures. The jury is waiting." "This is a matter of judicial ethics that requires immediate attention," Bondi continued, retrieving a sealed folder from her briefcase. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. "Approach the bench," he ordered. Bondi moved forward, as did Martin Reynolds from the defense. At the bench, safely out of the jury's hearing, Gates leaned forward. "Whatever game you're playing, Miss Bondi, I suggest you reconsider. My patience is limited." Bondi placed the sealed folder on the bench. "This isn't a game, Your Honor. This is a formal ethics complaint detailing a pattern of judicial misconduct spanning 17 cases over the past 4 years, including documented financial connections between Your Honor and parties appearing before this court." The color drained slightly from Gates's face, but he recovered quickly. "This is outrageous. You're attempting to intimidate the court because your case is falling apart. The complaint was filed with the Judicial Ethics Committee in the Department of Justice 3 months ago," Bondi replied evenly. "Today's filing is merely an update with yesterday's transcript attached as further evidence." Reynolds, caught completely off guard, stepped back slightly. "Your Honor, the defense has no knowledge of these allegations. It's because they concern the court, not your client, counsel," Bondi explained. "Though the pattern of favorable rulings for clients of your firm is extensively documented." Gates's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his desk. "This is a desperate stunt, Miss Bondi. I will not be threatened in my own courtroom." "It's not a threat, Your Honor. It's a legal filing containing evidence that you've received over $840,000 in indirect payments through various shell companies in exchange for favorable rulings. The funds were traced through your son's real estate company, Westlake Properties, through 3 offshore accounts and ultimately to your personal finances." A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom as observers noted the tense exchange at the bench. Several jurors exchanged curious glances, sensing something significant was transpiring. Gates turned to his bailiff. "Clear the courtroom." "That would be inadvisable, Your Honor," Bondi said calmly. "Closing the courtroom at this juncture could be interpreted as obstruction." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Gates's face. He was a skilled legal mind, and he recognized the carefully laid trap surrounding him. His gaze darted to the gallery, noting faces he hadn't registered before. 2 men in the back row who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. "We will take a 30-minute recess," Gates announced abruptly. "Jury is excused." As the jury filed out, Gates turned to Bondi, his voice low and threatening. "You've made a serious miscalculation, counselor. When this baseless attack collapses, I'll ensure you never practice law again." Bondi met his gaze steadily. "The evidence speaks for itself, Your Honor, and there's considerably more than what's contained in that folder." As Gates retreated to his chambers, the courtroom erupted in hushed conversations. The defense team huddled in urgent consultation, while several observers discreetly made phone calls from the hallway. Bondi returned to her table, calm and focused. Her team exchanged subtle nods. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The sealed document had been the first move in a carefully orchestrated sequence that had been months in preparation. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for Judge Gates to make his next move. When Judge Gates returned to the bench, the transformation was striking. His earlier arrogance had hardened into something more dangerous, a cornered predator's defiance. He had removed his reading glasses, and his eyes darted continuously between Bondi, the gallery, and the courtroom doors. "Court is back in session," he announced, his voice strained despite obvious efforts to maintain control. "The jury will remain excused while we address these procedural matters." Bondi stood. "Your Honor, given the nature of the ethics complaint, the state requests that you recuse yourself from this case, effective immediately." Gates's jaw tightened. "Request denied. These unsubstantiated allegations have no bearing on my ability to preside over this trial." Then I'm obligated to read the principal allegations into the record, Bondi replied. You will do no such thing, Gates snapped, banging his gavel. This is my courtroom, Miss Bondi. With respect, Your Honor, judicial ethics regulations are clear on this matter. When a formal complaint is filed, the allegations must be entered into the record if recusal is denied. The defense attorney, Reynolds, rose hesitantly. Your Honor, given these developments, the defense requests a continuance to assess. Denied, Gates interrupted harshly. We're proceeding with this trial. Bondi remained standing, document in hand. For the record, the ethics complaint alleges that Judge Howard Gates has engaged in a pattern of judicial corruption, including accepting bribes through intermediary companies, showing demonstrable bias in cases involving specific law firms and corporate interests, and failing to disclose financial conflicts of interest. Gates's face flushed deep red. Ms. Bondi, you are dangerously close to contempt. The evidence submitted includes bank records showing transfers of funds from shell companies connected to defendants in Judge Gates's court, including transactions coinciding with favorable rulings in the Marshall, Donovan, and Westridge cases. Additionally, documentation shows Judge Gates failed to disclose personal connections to the defendant in our current case, including attendance at private fundraising events and a previously undisclosed business relationship. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the court reporter's fingers had momentarily paused over her stenotype machine. That is enough, Gates shouted, rising from his chair. Bailiff, remove Miss Bondi from my courtroom. The bailiff hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. In that moment of uncertainty, Richard Harmon, the DOJ attorney, stood up from his seat behind the prosecution table. Your Honor, Richard Harmon, Department of Justice, I need to inform you that the allegations Miss Bondi has referenced are part of an active federal investigation. Gates froze, his gaze locking onto Harmon. This is an ambush, he whispered almost to himself. The investigation has been ongoing for 11 months, Harmon continued. Miss Bondi's cooperation has been instrumental in documenting a pattern of judicial misconduct across multiple jurisdictions. Gates sank slowly back into his chair, the realization dawning that this was far beyond a prosecutorial stunt. This was a coordinated federal action that had been building for nearly a year. You've been monitoring my courtroom, he said flatly. Among other things, Bondi confirmed. Yesterday's conduct was particularly enlightening as it demonstrated clear bias against the prosecution in ways that aligned perfectly with previous cases where financial incentives had been traded. The defense table had gone completely still, Reynolds and his client seemingly paralyzed by the unfolding scene. Several members of the gallery were quietly making their way toward the exits, not wanting to be associated with what was clearly becoming a historic legal implosion. Gates's hand moved toward his gavel, but it was trembling now. His authority, so absolute just 24 hours earlier, was disintegrating before everyone's eyes. This court is adjourned until, he began. I'm afraid we can't allow that, Your Honor, Harmon interrupted, nodding toward the back of the courtroom, where the two men Bondi had noticed earlier were now moving forward, their federal badges visible. In that moment, Judge Howard Gates finally understood the full dimensions of the trap he had walked into. A trap that had been meticulously crafted by the very prosecutor he had spent 2 days insulting and undermining. The federal agents paused at the gallery railing, not yet entering the inner sanctum of the court, but their presence spoke volumes. The prosecutor from the Justice Department nodded to Bondi, signaling her to proceed. Your Honor, Bondi said, her voice now carrying a quiet authority that filled the stunned courtroom, I'd like to submit into evidence documents that directly connect you to the case before this court. She opened a leather portfolio and extracted a series of papers, handing copies to the clerk and the defense. These are bank records showing transfers from Meridian Holdings, a subsidiary company owned by the defendant, to Westlake Development, the company controlled by your son, which you failed to disclose in your financial statements. Gates's breathing had become shallow, his eyes darting between the documents and the exits. These records would have required subpoenas. You've been investigating me personally? The investigation began with statistical anomalies in case outcomes, Bondi explained, almost pedagogical in her tone. When a judge rules in favor of defendants represented by certain law firms at rates significantly exceeding statistical norms, it raises questions. When those rulings coincide with financial windfalls for companies connected to the judge's family, those questions demand answers. She laid another document on the evidence table. This is a summary of rulings in cases where the defense was represented by the Jensen, Reynolds, and Morris firm. You ruled against prosecution motions 87% of the time, more than double the rate of any other judge in the circuit. Reynolds, the defense attorney, had gone pale. Your Honor, the defense had no knowledge of any improper relationship. Save it, counselor, Gates snapped, his composure cracking. This is clearly a coordinated attack on judicial independence. Bondi shook her head slightly. It's an enforcement of judicial ethics, Your Honor. The cornerstone of our legal system is the public's faith that judges will be impartial arbiters of justice, not participants in pay-for-play schemes. She turned to address the crowded courtroom directly. For the record, the prosecution has submitted evidence showing that Judge Gates has received approximately $3,020,000 in indirect payments over 7 years, carefully laundered through real estate investments, consulting fees, and offshore accounts. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The amount was staggering, even for the jaded court observers present. Gates slammed his gavel repeatedly. "This court is adjourned! Everyone out now!" But his authority had evaporated. No one moved. Additionally, Bondi continued steadily, we've documented communications between Judge Gates and defense counsel in this and previous cases, communications that occurred outside proper channels and were never disclosed to the prosecution. She turned to the federal agents who now stepped forward. Given the weight of evidence and Judge Gates's clear intent to obstruct these proceedings, I believe federal authorities are prepared to take appropriate action. Richard Harmon, the DOJ attorney, stood. We are, Miss Bondi. Gates's face had lost all color, the realization that he had severely underestimated his opponent, and in fact played directly into her hands with his condescending behavior dawning in his eyes. This is a setup, he said hoarsely. You deliberately provoked me yesterday to create evidence. Your pattern of behavior was well established long before yesterday, Bondi replied. Your treatment of the prosecution in this case merely confirmed what the financial evidence already proved. She placed a final document on the clerk's desk. For the record, this is a formal request from the Department of Justice to the State Judicial Ethics Board for immediate suspension of Judge Howard Gates pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. Court personnel exchanged shocked glances. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every word of what was clearly a historic legal moment. Gates made one last attempt to regain control. I am still the presiding judge in this courtroom. This proceeding is over, and I will have Miss Bondi held in contempt. He turned to the bailiff. Remove her from my courtroom immediately. The bailiff looked uncertainly between the judge and the federal agents, who now stood at the prosecution table. Wisely, he remained where he was. Howard Gates, one of the agents said formally, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of judicial corruption, accepting bribes, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The second agent moved toward the bench. Please step down, sir. For a moment it seemed Gates might physically resist. His hands gripped the edges of the bench, and his body tensed visibly. Then, as the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him, his shoulders slumped. The mighty Judge Gates, who had terrorized attorneys and defendants for years from his elevated position, slowly descended the steps from his bench for the last time. No longer a feared judicial authority, but a criminal defendant facing the very system he had corrupted. A profound silence fell over courtroom 4B as Judge Howard Gates descended the 3 steps from his bench. His black robes, once a symbol of judicial authority, now seemed to hang from his frame like a shroud. The federal agents flanked him immediately, professional and restrained, but leaving no doubt about who was in control. I want my attorney present, Gates said, his voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. That's your right, sir, the lead agent replied. You'll have the opportunity to contact counsel once we've processed you. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The judge, who had denied countless defendants their procedural rights, was now invoking his own. Several spectators exchanged knowing glances, while others simply sat in stunned disbelief at the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. "Your Honor," the agent continued with subtle emphasis on the title, "I'm required to inform you that you're being arrested on federal charges, including judicial corruption, accepting bribes, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda warning continued, Gates stared straight ahead, his face a mask of grim resignation. The man who had spent decades controlling his courtroom with imperious authority was now experiencing the criminal justice system from the other side, a defendant facing serious charges. Robert Keller, the original defendant in the fraud case, leaned toward his attorney with growing panic. "What happens to my case now?" he whispered urgently. Before Reynolds could answer, Pam Bondi approached their table. "Mr. Keller, in light of these developments, I'm offering one opportunity to cooperate with our investigation into judicial corruption. Your knowledge of how these arrangements work could be valuable." Keller's eyes widened as he realized the implications. If Gates had been taking bribes to rule in his favor, that made Keller potentially complicit in corrupting a judicial official, an additional charge that could significantly increase his sentence. "I need to consult with my client," Reynolds said quickly, but the damage was done. The seed of potential cooperation had been planted, and both men knew that the carefully constructed defense strategy had just crumbled. At the center of the courtroom, the federal agents were preparing to escort Gates away. One held out a suit jacket, a small courtesy to allow the judge to remove his robes and lead with some dignity intact. Gates shrugged off his judicial robes, revealing an expensive tailored shirt with monogrammed cuffs. The symbolism was lost on no one, the mantle of judicial authority removed, revealing the man of wealth and privilege beneath. As the agents moved to place handcuffs on Gates, a commotion arose near the courtroom doors. A distinguished older man in an expensive suit pushed through, followed by two younger attorneys carrying briefcases. "I'm representing Judge Gates," the man announced. "Harold Finch, Finch and Associates. There will be no statement, no handcuffs, and we're invoking all applicable privileges immediately." The lead federal agent paused, then continued securing the handcuffs. "Your client is being arrested on a federal warrant, Counselor. You can meet him at processing." Finch's face reddened. "Do you know who this man is? The connections he has? This will not stand." Bondi stepped forward. "Mr. Finch, your client's connections are precisely what led to this moment. Every special treatment, every backroom deal, every corrupted ruling is documented. If you're wise, you'll advise him to cooperate rather than threaten federal officers." The attorney fell silent, recognizing the strength of Bondi's position. Gates, now handcuffed, looked smaller somehow, diminished by the removal of the authority that had defined him for so long. As the agents prepared to lead him away, Gates turned toward Bondi. For a moment, the mask of arrogance fell completely, revealing a flicker of something resembling respect, or perhaps simply the recognition that he had been outmaneuvered by an opponent he had fatally underestimated. "Well played, Counselor," he said quietly. Bondi didn't respond. This wasn't about winning a personal contest. It was about restoring integrity to a system Gates had corrupted. The courtroom doors opened and a chorus of gasps and exclamations erupted from the hallway as word spread about what was happening. Reporters who had been covering the original fraud case suddenly found themselves documenting a far more sensational story: the arrest of a sitting judge on corruption charges. Cameras flashed as Gates was led through the public corridor, his head bowed to avoid the lenses. The man who had ruled his courtroom with imperious disdain just hours earlier was now the lead story on every local news outlet, the powerful judge brought down by the very prosecutor he had belittled. Behind them, in the now chaotic courtroom, Bondi conferred quietly with the DOJ officials about next steps. The fraud case against Keller would proceed, but under very different circumstances, and with the added dimension of investigating how deep the corruption had spread through the legal community. 3 weeks later, Pam Bondi stood before a different judge in a different courtroom. Judge Elisa Watkins, brought in from a neighboring circuit to ensure impartiality, presided over the reconvened fraud case against Robert Keller. "The state calls Raymond Phillips to the stand," Bondi announced. Phillips, Judge Gates' former law clerk, approached the witness box nervously. After being sworn in, he faced Bondi's careful questioning. Mr. Phillips, could you explain to the court your duties when you served as Judge Gates's clerk during the Wilson real estate fraud case in 2022? I researched case law, prepared bench memos, and occasionally handled communications between the judge and attorneys, Phillips replied. Did those communications ever include ones that weren't part of the official record? Phillips hesitated, glancing at Judge Watkins, who nodded encouragingly. Yes. Judge Gates sometimes had me arrange meetings with defense attorneys outside normal channels. Did these meetings include defendants represented by the Jensen, Reynolds, and Morris firm? Yes, frequently. As Phillips's testimony continued, the systematic pattern of corruption became increasingly clear. Gates had been the linchpin in a web of judicial misconduct that had undermined dozens of cases and potentially allowed millions in fraudulent activity to go unpunished. In the gallery, several reporters took detailed notes. The story had exploded beyond a single corrupt judge to expose vulnerabilities in the entire judicial system. Reform commissions had already been announced at both state and federal levels. During a brief recess, Richard Harmon from the DOJ approached Bondi. 17 indictments so far, he said quietly. Your work here has opened doors we've been trying to get through for years. It was never about Gates personally, Bondi replied. It was about what happens when we allow anyone to place themselves beyond accountability. When court resumed, Robert Keller, the original defendant whose case had triggered these events, appeared with new counsel. His expensive defense team had been replaced by a single attorney known for negotiating plea agreements. Your Honor, the attorney addressed Judge Watkins, my client wishes to change his plea and enter into a cooperation agreement with the state. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Keller, once defiant behind the shield of Gates's protection, now looked defeated. Judge Watkins turned to Bondi. Is the state amenable to this arrangement? We are, Your Honor, Bondi replied, provided Mr. Keller's cooperation is complete and truthful regarding all aspects of his case and any knowledge of judicial impropriety. The judge nodded. Very well. We'll proceed with the plea agreement. As the formal process unfolded, Bondi reflected on the chain of events that had led to this moment. What had begun as a straightforward fraud prosecution had evolved into one of the most significant judicial corruption cases in the state's history. Gates, once untouchable in his black robes and elevated bench, was now facing decades in federal prison. After the proceedings concluded, Bondi gathered her team in the corridor outside. The state attorney's office just called, her assistant informed her. They're reviewing every case Gates presided over in the past 5 years. Dozens of verdicts might be overturned. Bondi nodded. That's appropriate. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about ensuring the system itself maintains integrity. A reporter approached, microphone extended. Miss Bondi, how does it feel to bring down a corrupt judge who publicly insulted and undermined you? Bondi considered the question carefully. This isn't about personal vindication. Judge Gates' behavior toward me in court was merely a symptom of a much deeper problem, the belief that power places certain people beyond accountability. Today's outcome reaffirms that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or connections. As the media dispersed and her team headed back to their offices, Bondi remained for a moment in the corridor, gazing at the courthouse's marble pillars and engraved promise of equal justice under law. For years, Howard Gates had made a mockery of that promise, using his position to pervert the very justice he was sworn to uphold. His downfall wouldn't repair all the damage he had done, but it sent a powerful message throughout the legal community that the system could and would correct itself when integrity demanded it. Bondi gathered her files and headed toward the exit. There would be more cases, more challenges, more officials who believed their power made them untouchable. But today, at least, the scales of justice had been rebalanced. As she pushed through the courthouse doors into the bright afternoon sunlight, Bondi allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. In a profession often criticized for its bureaucracy and inefficiency, today had been a reminder of why she had chosen this path, because sometimes, when the evidence was clear and courage prevailed, justice was indeed served. This story leaves us with a powerful lesson. No one is above accountability, no matter how untouchable they seem. Judge Gates wielded his authority like a shield, but Pam Bondi proved that justice, when backed by evidence and resolve, can topple even the mightiest. In our own lives, This reminds us to stand firm against unfairness, whether it's a bully at work, a corrupt system, or even our own doubts. Integrity and persistence can shift the scales, not just in courtrooms, but in everyday battles. It's a call to question power, demand fairness, and never underestimate the impact of doing what's right. Thanks for watching this incredible tale. Your support keeps these stories alive. Drop a comment with your thoughts. What would you have done in Bondi's shoes? Like, subscribe, and hit that bell so we can keep exploring justice together.